I trusted the woman who took care of him. I trusted her to give him his medicine, to watch over him when I couldn't, but she took the papers that named me. The will he wrote weeks ago was gone. I should have been the one holding it, feeling his careful handwriting beneath my fingers. Instead, I found empty drawers and excuses. Her smile felt too practiced, too calm. Something had shifted, though I didn't know how deep the betrayal ran. Someone I trusted had quietly stolen more than just a piece of paper. Have you ever had that gut feeling that someone you trusted is hiding something? That quiet suspicion that keeps you awake at night. Today, I need you to stay with me because what happened next changed everything. He was always so careful with his papers. Every receipt, every letter, every note was organized in neat little stacks around the house. But the will, the one that left everything to me, was gone. I searched the drawers, the safe, even the old filing cabinet in the garage. Nothing. Just empty spaces and that hollow feeling in my chest. I asked her, the nurse, if she had seen it. She smiled softly and said no. Her eyes didn't meet mine the way they used to. That smile that once reassured me now felt cold. I wanted to believe her. I tried to, but something inside me refused. Something told me this wasn't just forgetfulness. That day, I started noticing small things. Pills out of order, notes I hadn't written appearing on the fridge, the way she kept insisting she needed access to his accounts for his safety. I brushed it off at first. She was the caregiver, after all. But deep down, I felt the walls closing in. Every quiet step in the hallway made me tense. Every phone call made me wary. I didn't yet know she wasn't alone, that she had help, that someone else had been quietly watching, waiting, ready to take what wasn't theirs. The days after I noticed the will missing were a blur. I went through every drawer, every folder, every corner of that house we had shared for decades. The bills, the bank statements, even his old letters. Everything was in order, except that one piece of paper that mattered most. The one that named me as the person he trusted with his life, his legacy. Gone. I started asking questions, carefully at first. I spoke to the accountant, to the lawyer who had helped him draft the will. They asked me for details I didn't know. When I mentioned the missing will, the lawyer frowned and asked for a copy. A copy I didn't have. My stomach turned. How could something so important just vanish? Then came the small hints, the things I had ignored before. The nurse kept lingering near the safe, asking about when I'd last accessed it. She had started making helpful suggestions about organizing his papers, making things easier for everyone. The voice in my head, that nagging whisper of suspicion, started to scream. I installed a small camera in the living room. At first, I felt ridiculous, spying on someone I had trusted. But the footage showed her, moving carefully, glancing around, pulling open drawers. And then I saw him, her partner, someone I had never noticed before, slipping in quietly, taking a folder from the top shelf. My heart froze. My hands shook. I watched them, over and over. Their coordinated movements, their quiet smiles, the way they acted as if they were untouchable. It wasn't just the will. It was every little thing he had trusted them with. Every prescription, every check, every quiet corner of his life. They were erasing me, piece by piece, and I had been blind until now. I didn't know what to do next. Call the police, confront them. My fear was thick in my throat, a heavy weight that made my chest ache. But beneath the fear was something else. Rage, the kind that bubbles up slowly, quietly, until you can't ignore it anymore. I knew I had to act, not recklessly, not immediately, but I had to find proof, evidence that would make them accountable. And that's when I realized the depth of their plan. They hadn't just taken a will, They had altered it. The handwriting, the dates, even the signature. They had forged it to make it seem like someone else, someone I didn't know, was the beneficiary. They had thought no one would notice. They had thought they were smarter than me. I wasn't about to let them get away with it. It was one of those quiet nights when the house felt too empty, too still. I had gone over the camera footage again, frame by frame, trying to memorize their movements, their faces, the subtle ways they covered their tracks. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just careless or forgetful. She had planned this. Every small favor, every helpful suggestion, every time she insisted she knew best, it had been rehearsed. I remembered the mornings when he insisted on having his coffee at exactly 8. She would come in, cheerful and patient, and pour it for him before he even stirred from bed. I never questioned it. I thought it was care, attention, love even. Now I realized it had been control. Slowly, quietly, she had inserted herself into every corner of his life. And it wasn't just her. That Nan who appeared in the footage, the one I hadn't noticed before, he was part of it too. The way he handled the papers, the way he waited while she distracted me, the way they smiled at each other like they were sharing a secret I was never meant to know. They had swapped the will, not just moved it, not just hidden it, they had changed it. I confronted her once, softly at first. "Have you seen the will?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, steady. She tilted her head, smiled that same practiced smile, and said, "I don't know what you mean." Her eyes were too sharp, too alert. That smile had teeth. I backed off, but my gut told me I had to dig deeper. I couldn't let her charm and rehearsed kindness fool me anymore. I spent the next days going through everything he had: old receipts, letters, journals, and bank statements. I cross-checked dates, handwriting, signatures. The inconsistencies started to show. Little things at first: a date that didn't match, a word written differently, a number slightly off. But together, they formed a pattern. They were meticulous, careful, but they weren't perfect. And I realized perfection wasn't necessary. All I needed was proof enough to expose them. The breaking point came when I found this small envelope tucked behind a row of books. It was labeled in his handwriting, just a single word: important. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a copy of the will, or rather, a version of the will. The handwriting was slightly different, the ink not quite matching, the signature off by a tiny angle. They had swapped the will. Not just moved it, not just hidden it. They had changed it. I felt rage, sorrow, betrayal all at once. Someone I had trusted with his life had tried to steal mine too. And now I had the proof. The evidence wasn't just enough to confront them. It was enough to make them accountable. But how do you confront someone who has practiced deceit for months, maybe years? How do you confront betrayal that hides behind smiles, kindness, and the illusion of care? I had no answer yet. All I knew was I couldn't let it go. I wouldn't. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every wind chime outside, every whisper of the house made me startle. I replayed the footage again and again. Her movements were smooth, rehearsed. He, her partner, was always just behind her, silent, waiting for the right moment. They had been patient, too patient. I realized they hadn't acted impulsively. They had been planning this for weeks, maybe months. Every missed appointment, every "I'll handle it" comment had been a step in their strategy. I needed more proof. Just seeing them on camera wasn't enough. I needed something concrete, something that a court would recognize. I began to set little traps. I left documents out in places where only someone snooping would see them. I started marking receipts subtly, leaving notes only I would recognize. It was slow work, painstaking, but I had time. I had to be methodical. If I rushed, I could lose everything. Every morning, I watched her come in, cheerful as ever. She carried her clipboard, checked his pills, smiled at him, and smiled at me. The same soft, practiced smile, as if she had done nothing wrong. I forced myself to act normal. I asked her questions casually, watched her reaction. She didn't slip. She never slipped. But I saw the subtle changes. A flicker of annoyance in her eyes when I asked about the safe. A pause, too long, before she answered where she had placed certain documents. Little tells. I collected them silently, like a hawk watching prey. The turning point came when I left a notebook on the kitchen counter. In it, I wrote a fake note about a family meeting to review his accounts. I didn't expect them to fall for it, but I wanted to see if they were watching. That evening, I reviewed the footage and froze. She had taken the notebook, not just looked at it. She had taken it, carried it down the hall, and slipped it into her bag. Her partner was with her, glancing around, cautious but complicit. That moment burned into my mind. They were bold, they were dangerous, and they thought they were untouchable. I called a private investigator the next day. I didn't tell anyone else yet. I needed discretion. When he arrived, I showed him the footage, the subtle inconsistencies in the will, the notes, the marked receipts. His eyes widened. He told me what I already feared. This was organized, systematic elder abuse and fraud. They had worked together, using charm and familiarity to manipulate him, isolate him, and steal from him. The investigator suggested installing more cameras, hidden ones, not just in the living room, but in the study, near the safe, in the hallways. I felt sick at the thought of turning my home into a surveillance zone, but I knew I had no choice. If I wanted justice, I couldn't rely on trust anymore. I had to rely on proof. Weeks passed. I watched every movement, every interaction. I noticed her small lies, a pill missing that she claimed he had taken, a document she insisted had already been filed, a call she said she hadn't made. And then there was the day I caught them swapping a folder, a crucial folder, containing bank statements and letters. My heart hammered in my chest. The proof was finally undeniable. I didn't confront them immediately. I stayed quiet, collecting more. Every time I felt a pang of fear or anger, I reminded myself why I was doing this. Not just for him, not just for me, but for every person who trusted someone to care for them, only to be betrayed. I began documenting everything meticulously: dates, times, actions, inconsistencies, camera stills, photos of the swap documents, even the subtle fingerprints left on the papers. Every detail mattered. And slowly, I felt a sense of control returning. Not the same control I had before the betrayal, but a different kind. The kind that comes from knowing the truth, and knowing that truth is power. But the tension never eased. Every time she smiled at me, every time he nodded politely, I felt a shiver. They knew I was suspicious. They knew something had shifted, and that made them dangerous. I realized something else too. This wasn't just about the will. This was about trust, about love, about a life spent believing someone. I woke up before sunrise the next morning because my mind would not quiet down. The house felt heavy, like the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. I moved through the rooms slowly and listened to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a neighbor dog, the faint rattle of the wind against the windows. Small sounds that used to comfort me now felt like warnings. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. I tried to steady my hand, but it trembled each time I remembered their faces. The nurse with her gentle voice and soft eyes, and her partner who moved like a shadow behind her. They had taken so much, and they had done it with such calm confidence. I wrote everything I could remember. Every moment that felt wrong, every strange sentence she had said, every odd visit her partner made to the house. The notebook filled quickly, and my fear slowly transformed into something sharper. When she arrived that morning, she brought flowers. They were bright, cheerful flowers, and she placed them in a vase near the window. She said she wanted to brighten the house. Her voice was warm, but her eyes flickered with something deeper, something calculating. I thanked her, even though each word tasted bitter. I watched her move around the kitchen, and every step she took felt rehearsed. She knew exactly where everything was, and she knew exactly how to hide her intentions. The private investigator had told me to act normal. He said people like her become bold when they think you are not paying attention. So I played along. I smiled. I asked simple questions. I offered her tea. She accepted with that same soft smile she used whenever she wanted to seem harmless. I placed the cup in front of her and noticed her eyes drift toward the hallway where the safe was. A small glance, but sharp enough for me to see her true focus. The investigator returned later that day with a small stack of printed stills from the footage. Each image felt like a knife, her reaching into drawers, her partner sliding documents into his bag, both of them standing close, whispering to each other while thinking no one could hear. He placed the stills on the table and asked if I was ready to move forward. I nodded, even though my stomach felt tight. We needed one final piece, one moment that captured them without doubt or question. So we decided to leave another document out in plain sight, a fake bank authorization form, placed on the desk near the window. I left the room and waited. The investigator waited too, and we watched from a quiet corner of the hall through a small monitor. Minutes passed. Then I saw her walk in. She looked around slowly, then approached the desk. Her fingers hovered over the paper like she was appreciating something delicate. She picked it up and read it. Her face tightened for a moment, then she folded the paper and slipped it into her sweater pocket. My breath caught in my chest. Her partner entered a moment later. They whispered back and forth, and their words carried more urgency than before. They were no longer cautious, they were confident. They believed they had full control. They believed I was too fragile, too grieving, too overwhelmed to fight back. They believed they had already won. The investigator quietly recorded their conversation. Their voices floated through the small speaker. Plans, dates, mentions of accounts, mentions of the will. My name spoken like an obstacle, not a person. Each sentence hit me like a blow. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room. I held the stills in my hands and stared at every detail. The curve of her smile that now felt sinister, the watch on his wrist, the way he positioned himself near the doorway, like someone trained in quiet exits. I felt grief for the man I had lost, but I felt something new too. Resolve. Strength I did not know I still had. The investigator told me we had enough to take to the authorities, but before he left, he said something that stayed with me. People like them rarely stop at one victim. They choose people who trust easily, people who carry heavy responsibilities, people who would rather avoid conflict. He said they had likely done this before, and they would do it again if no one stopped them. I thought about that long after he left. The idea that someone else might be sitting in their home right now, feeling confused, afraid, betrayed, someone just like me. And that changed something inside me. I was no longer just seeking justice for myself. I wanted to stop them before they destroyed another life. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen and found the nurse already there. She greeted me with a warm voice. She offered to make breakfast. She talked about the weather and the errands she planned to run. Her tone was cheerful, but I could hear something new in it, a thread of nerves woven through each word. She sensed the shift. She felt the air change. She knew I was no longer as trusting as before. Her partner arrived that afternoon. He said he needed to check the water heater. He said it casually, but he did not look at me. He walked down the hall with his hands tucked into his pockets. I watched him from the doorway. He moved too quickly, too purposefully, and the investigator's words echoed in my mind. People like him do not wait, they act. I knew then we had reached the breaking point. I could not allow them to stay in that house another day. I could not let them twist the truth any further. The next steps had to be sharp, clean, and irreversible. I had to make sure everything was documented before I made the call that would change all of our lives. I sat down again at the kitchen table and breathed deeply. My heart pounded against my ribs. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone. But beneath all of that, a new fire burned. Quiet, steady, and determined. I dialed the number without hesitation.
The phone felt heavy in my hand. Each ring echoed through the empty house as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. When the voice on the other end answered, calm and professional, I explained everything. Every detail, every inconsistency, every captured moment on camera. I told them about the altered will, the hidden notes, the subtle manipulations that had started long before I realized. I spoke quickly at first, then slowly, trying to make sure I didn't leave anything out. The officer on the line listened. He asked questions. He paused to take notes. I could hear the faint click of pens, the shuffle of papers. Then he said words that made my heart both sink and rise. They were sending a team. They would come to the house. They would review the footage. They would collect evidence. They would confront her. I hung up and immediately felt the house close in around me. I walked from room to room, checking drawers, looking at the safe, at the kitchen counter where she had once folded that notebook into her bag. Everything seemed suddenly fragile and vulnerable. I felt exposed. And yet beneath that fear was something else. Strength, a fierce, quiet determination. When they arrived, I followed the officers through each room. I showed them the camera stills, the hidden footage, the notebooks, the marked documents. I felt every fiber of my being tense with anticipation. They listened, they nodded, they murmured agreements. It was finally happening. Someone was seeing what I had been seeing all along. And then she walked in. The nurse, cheerful, poised, unaware of the storm about to hit. She greeted me, offered a bright smile, and my stomach twisted. Her partner followed, just as confident, just as calm. The officers moved with quiet precision. They spoke to her first. The words came sharp and clear. Questions, evidence, accusations. Her smile faltered ever so slightly, a flicker in her eyes, the first crack in the mask. I watched her partner stiffen. He shifted his weight, hands slightly clenched. I could feel the tension coil like a spring in the room. It was as if the calm they had maintained for months had finally been pierced. The officers continued, presenting proof they could not deny. The camera footage, the altered documents, the discrepancies meticulously recorded. They spoke firmly, legally, without hesitation. And then the arrests were made. The nurse's partner was led out first, hands behind his back, his expression tight with disbelief. She followed, still trying to maintain some semblance of composure, but her eyes darted around, calculating, realizing she had lost control. The weight of every deceit, every manipulation, every stolen moment was suddenly pressing down on her. I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering shock. The house felt different once they were gone. Lighter, quieter, but the absence of their presence did not erase the memory of what had been done. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the empty chairs, the safe, the stack of papers now untouched. I realized how close I had come to losing everything, how easily trust can be broken, even by someone who seems kind. The court proceedings that followed were long and exhausting. Testimonies, cross-examinations, legal arguments that dragged for hours. I had to relive every small betrayal, every stolen document, every quiet manipulation. The nurse and her partner attempted to lie, to redirect blame, to paint themselves as innocent helpers, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every frame, every note, every marked document supported the truth I had fought to preserve. In the end, criminal charges were filed, convictions were made. The judge's words were stern, final. Justice, at least partially, had been served. But even as the gavel fell, I knew that some wounds could not be erased. Trust once broken leaves scars that linger. I would always remember the look in their eyes the day the truth came out, the realization that control was no longer theirs, that I had reclaimed what was mine. And yet, even as I left the courthouse, I felt the lingering shadow of betrayal. My home, my peace, my sense of safety, they had been shaken. I had justice, yes, but I also had caution, wariness, a heightened awareness that some people could wear kindness like armor while hiding cruelty beneath. I returned home that evening. The house felt quiet, finally. I opened drawers, checked the safe, handled the papers. Everything was exactly where it should have been. I let out a slow breath and felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Relief that the ordeal was over. Exhaustion from the emotional toll, the fear, the constant vigilance. And as I sat alone, I realized something else. Even with justice served, the scars of betrayal do not disappear. They linger in small moments. A glance at the door, a pause before opening the safe, a hesitation before trusting again, but at the same time, I felt a spark of something new. Resilience. Strength born from surviving deceit, from standing firm when others tried to erase me, from reclaiming what was mine. I knew that life would go on. I knew I would be cautious, vigilant, perhaps slower to trust, but I also knew that I had the courage to protect what I loved. That even after betrayal, even after manipulation, even after the darkest moments, it was possible to rise, to fight, to reclaim control, to survive.
The day after the arrests, the house felt like a hollow shell. I walked through the room slowly, touching surfaces that had once felt safe: the coffee table, the kitchen counter, the safe. Every object reminded me of what had almost been lost: the will, the trust, the life we had built. I realized that even with justice served, the consequences of betrayal ripple outward like stones thrown into water. Family members began to show up. Some came with concern, some with curiosity, some with judgment in their eyes. I saw the confusion, the hurt, the disbelief. They wanted answers, they wanted explanations, they wanted to know how something like this could happen under my watch. I wanted to tell them everything, to lay bare every deceit, every lie, every small manipulation that had gone unnoticed for months. But I hesitated. How do you explain betrayal that cuts deeper than theft, that undermines the very foundation of trust? How do you explain that someone you allowed into your home, someone you believed cared, had been plotting to steal everything that mattered to you? Words felt inadequate. Actions seemed insufficient, and so I shared only fragments. Enough for them to understand, but not so much that the memory would overwhelm us all at once. Conversations with my family were tense. My siblings asked questions with caution. My children tried to process the events quietly. Some struggled to believe that someone could be so deceptive, so calculated. Others, like me, felt the lingering weight of disbelief. We had been blind. We had all been blind. And yet there was anger too. Anger that someone could exploit a lifetime of love and care for their own gain. I noticed subtle changes in myself as well. I flinched when unexpected knocks came at the door. I double-checked every envelope, every letter, every document. I questioned kindness, gestures, smiles. I realized that betrayal had a long shadow, stretching into every part of life, coloring perceptions, reshaping instincts. Trust would never come easily again. And yet there was also resilience, a quiet, steady resolve that I did not fully understand until I saw the look on my family's faces as they slowly began to grasp the truth. Relief mingled with sorrow, understanding with grief. They saw what I had endured. They recognized the careful patience, the quiet vigilance, the courage it had taken to confront deception and reclaim what was rightfully mine. We began to talk more openly about safety, about caution, about the importance of boundaries. We shared memories of my loved one, the one whose will had been altered, whose life had been manipulated. We honored him by protecting what remained, by ensuring that his intentions would finally be respected. The healing process was slow. Emotional scars remained, but there was progress, small but meaningful steps toward trust rebuilt. I realized something else too. Even though justice had been served in a legal sense, personal recovery was an entirely different journey. The nurse and her partner had been removed from our lives, but the memories, the fear, the betrayal, they lingered. I had to learn to coexist with them, to acknowledge their presence in my past without letting them dictate my future. Some days, I still find myself staring at the safe, double-checking documents, replaying moments in my head. But I have also begun to reclaim moments of peace. I allow myself to smile without hesitation, to answer the door without suspicion, to trust selectively, carefully, and intentionally. It is not full trust, not yet, but it is a start. And as I sit in the quiet of the evening, I recognize that this journey is far from over. The fear may never fully disappear. The memory of betrayal may always be with me. But so too is the knowledge that I survived, that I acted decisively, that I reclaimed what had been taken. The experience has left me wary, yes, but it has also left me stronger than I ever imagined. I know that life will never be the same. I know that trust will always carry a weight I must consider, but I also know that I can face the world with caution and courage, that even after betrayal, after manipulation, after deceit, it is possible to rebuild, to reclaim, to survive, and to protect what matters most.
The courtroom felt surreal. I had never imagined sitting there, recounting every detail of months of deceit, every manipulation, every stolen moment of trust. The walls were tall, the ceiling high, and the air seemed heavy, almost deliberate in its stillness. I gripped the edge of the bench, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers, grounding myself as the proceedings began. The nurse and her partner were present, their expressions carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in their eyes, the subtle twitch of muscles, the way they avoided looking at me directly. The judge called the room to order, and the trial began. Evidence was presented: camera footage, altered documents, marked receipts. The attorneys moved with precision, narrating each act of deceit, weaving a story of manipulation and fraud that was undeniable. I watched as my life, the months of careful observation, the sleepless nights, the painstaking documentation, was laid bare. The officers, the investigator, the lawyers, they all became my voice in moments when my own might have faltered. I realized how much weight each word carried, how each frame of footage could tip the balance toward justice or leave it elusive. Testimonies followed. I spoke cautiously but firmly, recounting the small moments, the subtle manipulations, the odd behaviors that seemed harmless at the time but now revealed their true intent. I watched as my witnesses corroborated my story, adding layers of proof. little threads of truth that formed a tapestry no lie could unravel. Each confirmation brought a quiet relief, but also a fresh wave of grief, a reminder of the betrayal I had endured. Her defense attorney attempted to cast doubt, to suggest mistakes, to imply exaggeration. He questioned dates, motives, even my own perception, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every camera still, every marked document, every recorded interaction pointed to the same conclusion: deliberate, calculated, and cruel manipulation designed to deprive me of what was rightfully mine. I noticed subtle shifts in my family as well. They sat quietly, listening, their eyes fixed on the proceedings. Some flinched at moments of tension. Some pressed hands to their mouths in disbelief. But there was also pride in their expressions, a recognition of the courage it had taken to bring this to light. The courtroom became a stage not just for legal proceedings, but for validation. My pain, my vigilance, my determination, it mattered here. It counted. Days passed, the trial stretched on. Each session brought new revelations: phone records, testimony from neighbors, even evidence of previous schemes the nurse and her partner had attempted in other households. The scope of their manipulation was staggering, but it confirmed what I had suspected from the start. They were not careless. They were deliberate. And now, finally, the law was catching up with them. When the verdict was announced, there was a heavy silence. Guilty. The words echoed in the chamber, resounding in a way that felt both final and surreal. The relief was immediate, but muted. Justice had been served in a legal sense, but the emotional weight of betrayal lingered. The nurse and her partner would face consequences, yes, but the trust that had been broken could not simply be restored with a sentence. Returning home after the trial was strange. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The absence of their presence was liberating, but also haunting. I moved through the rooms, touching surfaces, opening drawers, examining the safe. Everything was exactly where it should have been, untouched, undisturbed. And yet I was acutely aware of the months of deception, of how easily they had slipped into our lives unnoticed. Family life began to adjust. Conversations were careful at first. Trust had been shaken, not just with the nurse and her partner, but with ourselves. We questioned how easily we had overlooked subtle signs, how long the betrayal had been in motion. And yet we also learned, slowly, to rebuild, to discuss, to communicate, to recognize the small red flags that could no longer be ignored. The trial and its consequences created ripples. Some relationships strengthened under the weight of shared vigilance. Others strained, revealing how fragile trust could be even within a family. The house remained a place of caution, but also of resilience. We learned that vigilance did not have to consume life. It could coexist with moments of peace, laughter, and memory. I realized that the legal process, as thorough and exhaustive as it had been, was only one layer of recovery. The real work was personal. It was navigating grief, fear, and lingering suspicion while learning to reclaim control over daily life. It was reminding myself that I had the power to protect what mattered most, that I had survived betrayal, manipulation, and deceit, and that I could rebuild a life where safety and trust, though measured, were possible again. And so I did, slowly, carefully, one day at a time. The weeks after the trial were quiet, but heavy. I moved through the house like someone learning its corners for the first time. Every drawer, every counter, every shelf reminded me of what had been taken, what had been violated, what had almost disappeared. I touched objects carefully, as if by doing so I could restore some sense of safety. Family visits became more intentional. Conversations were slower, deeper, measured. We spoke about the past, about the betrayal, about the pain we had endured. Some questions remained unspoken. How could someone we trusted act with such calculation? How could kindness be a disguise for cruelty? I didn't always have answers. Some questions could not be answered. Evenings were the hardest. Silence settled over the house, pressing in against my ears. I would sit in the living room, the soft hum of the refrigerator a reminder of normalcy, and think about him, about the man who had written the will, about the life we had shared, about how carefully he had planned for me to be protected. I held on to that memory, like a lifeline, a reminder that love and care still existed, even in the shadow of betrayal. Trust became a careful practice. I double checked letters, verified phone calls, questioned unexpected favors. It was exhausting. And yet, with each cautious step, I felt a subtle reclaiming of power. I had been manipulated, I had been deceived, but I had survived. And survival brought with it a strange, quiet confidence. I spoke with my children about vigilance, about observing without judgment, about knowing when to act. They listened carefully, absorbing lessons that were harsh but necessary. And in those moments, I realized the legacy left to me was more than material. It was awareness, resilience, and an understanding of human nature that could never again be ignored. Some nights I caught myself hesitating before answering the door or checking the mailbox. Fear lingered like a shadow. But gradually, the fear loosened its grip. I learned to recognize the difference between caution and paranoia, between prudence and fear. I rebuilt routines, regained independence, and allowed myself small moments of joy. A cup of tea in the morning sunlight, the scent of fresh flowers, the laughter of a child visiting from across the street. The house felt lighter over time. Spaces that once carried tension now held echoes of laughter and quiet contentment. And yet I never forgot. I never stopped noticing the subtleties of behavior, the importance of careful observation. Betrayal had left its mark, but the mark also carried lessons, lessons in vigilance, in protecting oneself, and in recognizing that strength often grows in quiet, patient increments. I realized that while legal justice had been served, emotional justice required ongoing work. The scars of deception, once cut deep, did not disappear overnight. They lingered in subtle ways: a hesitation, a careful glance, a thoughtful pause. But I learned to live alongside them, to navigate life with a renewed understanding, and to reclaim control over the parts of my world I could safeguard. And in that reclamation, I discovered something unexpected: a quiet pride, a deep and enduring resilience, a reminder that even after betrayal, even after deceit, even after manipulation, it is possible to reclaim one's life, one day at a time. The family gatherings that followed the trial were quiet at first. We sat around the table, careful not to say too much, careful not to stir old wounds too quickly. Everyone was wary, eyes flicked toward one another, searching for unspoken truths. Some members were protective, some skeptical, and some just quietly mourning the sense of safety that had been stolen from all of us. I noticed subtle changes in myself, too. I paused before offering trust, hesitated before delegating responsibility, watched small gestures with heightened awareness. It wasn't fear anymore. It was a form of armor I had forged over months of deception and investigation. And yet, I wanted to believe that family could still be a place of safety, a refuge, even after betrayal had shaken its foundation. My children approached me one evening. They asked questions, soft and tentative, about the nurse, about her partner, about how we had uncovered the truth. I answered carefully, not hiding details, but pacing them in a way that would not overwhelm. They listened, wide-eyed, realizing for the first time the full depth of what had happened. And I realized they were learning more than facts. They were learning resilience, courage, and the importance of vigilance. Attempts at reconciliation with some distant relatives were awkward. They expressed concern and sorrow for what had happened, but also questioned how things could have gone unnoticed for so long. I understood their perspective, yet I also felt the sting of judgment. Betrayal had made me hyper aware of appearances versus reality. The polite smiles and cautious words reminded me that trust is a fragile thing, easily fractured and slow to rebuild. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the living room, staring at the safe. I opened it and held the will in my hands, the one that had been altered, the one that had been returned. Its edges were slightly worn, the ink a little faded in places, but it was finally mine to hold. I felt a wave of relief, but also a lingering wariness. The battle had been won, yes, but the vigilance I had learned was a permanent companion. I also began noticing small signs of healing. Laughter returned gradually during family visits. Shared meals felt warmer, conversations more genuine. We started creating routines that emphasized transparency and communication. My home slowly regained its sense of normalcy, though the shadow of the past never fully disappeared. It lingered in cautious glances, in deliberate checks of documents, in careful monitoring of strangers and new acquaintances. And yet, life also offered moments of joy. A quiet cup of tea in the morning sunlight, a letter from a relative I had longed to hear from, a phone call from a friend sharing ordinary news. Small things, yet they reminded me that trust, while fragile, could be nurtured again. That connection and love could exist even after deception had bruised the heart. I reflected often on the nurse and her partner, on their meticulous planning, on their confidence that they could manipulate and erase me. It was frightening, yes, but it was also a reminder of the human capacity for both cruelty and vigilance. I had survived their schemes, exposed their lies, and reclaimed what was mine. But I had also learned to recognize the signs, to trust my instincts, and to act decisively when something felt wrong. In those quiet moments, I realized something profound. Justice, vigilance, and resilience were not just reactions, they were choices. And by choosing to act, by choosing to reclaim control, I had not only protected myself, but also set an example for those I loved. The pain of betrayal remained, but it was tempered by the knowledge that I had endured, observed, and prevailed. Months passed, and the house felt different, quieter in some ways, safer in others. But the memory of betrayal lingered in corners, in drawers, in spaces that had once been contaminated by deceit. I walked through the rooms with a careful eye, checking documents, organizing papers, confirming schedules. Vigilance had become a habit, not an obsession, but a shield I could not easily remove. I began to notice subtler shifts in my own behavior. I paused before trusting anyone outside the family. I questioned motives politely, observed actions closely, and learned to recognize when kindness was genuine and when it was calculated. There was a tension in this, a constant balancing act between normalcy and precaution. And yet, with each careful step, I felt a quiet reclamation of power over my life. Family relationships, too, evolved. Some grew closer, strengthened by shared vigilance and the trauma we had endured together. Others remained tentative, cautious, forever altered by the shadow of what had happened. I saw my children learning from the experience, understanding the weight of responsibility and the subtle ways in which deception can infiltrate lives. It was a harsh lesson, but one that would protect them in the long run. The nurse and her partner were gone from our lives permanently. Their sentences were strict, their presence removed. Yet I felt their shadow still sometimes, in the silence of the evenings, in unexpected knocks, in the way I double-checked letters and phone calls. Fear had not vanished entirely, but it had transformed. It became awareness, prudence, a measured vigilance rather than terror. I found solace in small routines: morning tea on the porch, sunlight spilling over the table, a walk through the neighborhood, greeting neighbors with care but also a discerning eye, reading letters and documents, now with a sense of calm control. Life, in its ordinary motions, slowly became mine again. A life that had been threatened, almost stolen, but ultimately reclaimed. I also began journaling more consistently, not just about the betrayal, but about recovery, resilience, and the careful rebuilding of trust. I wrote about the lessons I had learned, the importance of observation, the value of evidence, the need to act decisively when deception appears. Each page was a quiet affirmation that I had survived, that I had regained agency, and that I would continue to protect myself and those I loved. And yet, moments of unease still appeared unexpectedly. A knock at the door, a phone call at an odd hour, a shadow passing too quickly across a window. Each time, I felt a pang of fear, quickly tempered by vigilance. I had learned to distinguish real threats from imagined ones, to act with intelligence rather than instinct alone. This was the subtle evolution of a life scarred by betrayal, but strengthened by survival. I realized something else too. Trust, once broken, cannot always be fully restored. It can be rebuilt, carefully, cautiously, slowly, but it is never the same as before. And that was okay, because trust is also a choice, a decision we make continually, informed by experience and tempered by awareness. I had made that choice for myself. I had survived the betrayal, reclaimed my life, and now I could decide who earned my trust going forward. Some days were easier than others. Some nights still carried shadows. But with each passing week, I felt a steadying strength. The house was mine again. The family, though changed, was resilient. The memories of manipulation and deceit had not vanished, but they no longer ruled me. They were reminders, not chains. And in that quiet reclamation of life, I realized something profound. Even after betrayal, after manipulation, after loss of trust, it is possible to rebuild, to regain control, to survive, to find a cautious peace, to protect oneself without surrendering to fear. The house felt different that morning, not just quiet, not just safe, but somehow lighter. I moved through the room slowly, noticing details I had long ignored: the sunlight spilling across the floor, the way the curtains swayed, the gentle hum of the refrigerator. These ordinary moments felt extraordinary after months of tension, manipulation, and vigilance. I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in a long while. The will rested in the safe, unaltered, complete. It represented more than inheritance. It was a symbol of the life I had fought to reclaim. I ran my fingers over the edge of the paper, feeling the texture, the weight, the permanence. Justice had been served in courts, yes, but holding it in my hands made it real in a personal way. A tangible reminder that truth, vigilance, and patience could overcome deceit. Family visits had returned to a cautious normal. We laughed quietly around the table, shared stories, and slowly rebuilt the bonds fractured by betrayal. Some conversations were awkward, some silences long, but each moment of connection felt earned. We were learning to trust again, carefully, deliberately, but with hope. The lessons had been harsh, but they had strengthened us, individually and together. I realized how deeply betrayal changes a person. Trust becomes measured. Kindness is scrutinized, every gesture is considered twice, but it also sharpens perception. It builds resilience, and it teaches the value of patience, observation, and courage. I had learned to navigate life with a heightened awareness without letting fear dominate. Even as peace returned, memories of the nurse and her partner lingered. I remembered their practiced smiles, their whispered plans, the ease with which they had moved through my home. But their presence no longer frightened me. It reminded me of strength, of vigilance, of the truth that had been uncovered, and of the justice I had fought to achieve. I began to embrace small joys again: sunlight on the porch, the aroma of fresh coffee, a letter from a distant friend. Moments that once seemed mundane now carried weight, depth, and gratitude. I realized that survival had given me a new appreciation for life's ordinary beauty. Trust, I understood, is fragile. Once broken, it can never be restored exactly as it was. But it can be rebuilt with care, with patience, and with awareness. I had done that for myself. I had survived deceit. I had reclaimed my home, my possessions, and my sense of control. And I had safeguarded the future for my family. I also understood that closure is not a single event. It is a process, a quiet journey that unfolds gradually. The scars of betrayal remain, yes, but they no longer define the landscape of my life. They are markers of survival, of vigilance, and of triumph over manipulation. I sat by the window that evening, sunlight fading into twilight. The house was quiet, safe, mine. I allowed a small smile, a deep breath, a moment of peace. I had endured. I had observed. I had acted. I had survived. And in that survival, I found strength, resilience, and a cautious, hard earned trust in the life I had fought to reclaim. Even after betrayal, even after manipulation, even after loss, it is possible to rise, to protect what matters, and to live again. And as night settled over the house, I realized that the fight had ended, but life, with all its quiet moments, its laughter, and its cautious trust, would continue, and I was ready to face it.